I want to ask you, for our viewers, about not just abortion, which I'll get to in a moment, and women's rights, but about former President Donald Trump, who is in criminal court in New York City for this hush money thing. Meanwhile, the documents case is delayed. Meanwhile, Georgia, what's going on here? Everything seems to be delayed and moving down the road. And there are even those who argue that this Manhattan case it's not as big, it's not serious, and he might get off anyway or not. And how do people manage especially people who really love this democracy, who take it seriously, who take the words that you just said on our show very seriously, that you can't just sit back and let democracy come to you, that this is every day something we all must work on together. What do you say to people when they ask you about the former president, these trials and these delays and the fear that they feel about the upcoming election?
Well, Mika, I'm happy to go to therapy with you anytime because clearly the pressure and the stress on our system, our country, our Constitution, our future is so intense for those of us who understand what's at stake. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way to others, but if you've been in this world as you and I have, and you've studied it and you've watched it, it is a very difficult time right now. Justice delayed is justice denied. And the people in our country, it looks as though, will most likely go to vote without knowing the outcome of these other very serious trials. And the one that is going on now currently in New York is really about election interference. It is about trying to prevent the people of our country from having relevant information that may have influenced how they could have voted in 2016 or whether they would have voted. I think that the defendant, the former president, knew exactly what he was doing when he went to such great lengths to try to squash, bury, kill stories, pay off people, because he understood the electoral significance of them. So I think that this is not, though, about the past, because the other cases are about election interference. And he's practically promised us, if you listen to him at his rallies, you read his interview with Time magazine, that if he doesn't like the way the election turns out, he's going to do something again to try to prevent the lawful winner from taking office. I mean, I was Secretary of State traveling around the world on behalf of our country, trying to persuade leaders to believe in democracy, to believe in the peaceful transfer of power, to accept election results after appropriate challenges were made. And, Trump had all the time in the world to make those challenges, and he was shut down by courts. He was denied by Republican as well as Democratic election officials because there was no evidence. This is all about power, how to get it, how to keep it, how not to give it up. That is so opposite of everything we believe or should believe in our country about how we are a nation of laws, not of men. And they are men who try to put themselves above the law, try to hang on to power. The other point I would quickly make is that the Supreme Court is doing our country a grave disservice in not deciding the case about immunity. I read the excellent decision by the Court of Appeals, and the judges there, I think, covered every possible argument. And what we heard when this case was tried before the Supreme Court, to my ear at least, were efforts to try to find loopholes, to try to create an opportunity for Trump to have attempted to overturn an election, to have carried out hundreds and hundreds of pages of very highly classified material for his own amusement, interest, trading, we don't know what. These are very serious charges against any American, but someone who's both been a president and wants to be a president again. That should cause any voter to think not twice, but many, many times over about whether we should entrust our country to him.
Madam Secretary, therapy session obviously officially over now.
Things. Wait, I need more.
Oh, do you need more? Do you need more? Okay, well, we'll tell you at the end that everything's going to be okay if Americans do their job and get out and vote. Madam Secretary, yesterday we interviewed Andrew Ross Sorkin, who talked to one of the founders, of Silicon Valley Revolution in the late 80s, early 90s, who said, as much as we're talking about AI, we're not talking about it enough. I feel the same about Donald Trump. Fortunately, we talk about him so much in the media that it's just hard to do it. It just really gets nauseating after a while. At the same time, I fear that for some Americans, they're not focusing in enough on a president who said he would be a dictator on day one, that he would terminate the Constitution, that he would execute the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staffs, that he would immediately jail reporters who he didn't like, that he would immediately find guilty of treason news organizations that didn't talk the way he wanted them to talk or run the way they wanted them to run. Now, we can go down the list. He said he was going to fire U.S. attorneys that wouldn't immediately jail his political opponents. We could go on and on. And I find myself thinking back, and people will say I'm being too dramatic. I don't think I am. I'm thinking back to a Richard Cohen column that was written probably in 2007, 2008, where he talked about this scene around a lake in Germany in 1937 and how peaceful and how beautiful it was, and everybody was going about their business. 1937, kids were playing, and then he said nobody saw it coming. Nobody saw it. A year later, the world had changed. Jews were being rounded up, slaughtered, executed. So we find ourselves in this sort of a dilemma. We seem to talk about him so much, and yet I don't know that people are really getting their arms around just what a threat a democracy, American democracy, the American experiment is facing right now. Help us out with that, if you will.
You know, Joe, I think you make a really important point. I mean, it's one thing to cover the circus, and the circus is covered. I mean, people can't stop covering the circus. Every utterance, every insult, every outrageous action or comment, it gets covered. The context is often missing. What does that really mean? And I think it's imperative, especially for members of the press who understand, as you were just pointing out, the world has been here before. People did not take the kind of threats that we saw in the 1930s as seriously as they should, including American journalists. You know, people were taking at face value that, oh, this can be controlled. He may have said some outrageous things, but, you know, the institutions will hold. A determined demagogue, unfortunately supported by members of his political party, other enablers, people who care more about a future tax cut than the sanctity of the Constitution, are falling in line behind him. They are trying to excuse some of the most outrageous things that you just recited. And I don't think the press has done enough to basically say, okay, the circus is here. You can watch the circus, but let's tell you what that means. Let's talk to people who have a real understanding of how dictatorships evolve. Let's look at the people that he admires and what they've already done. You know, back in 2016, we didn't have interviews with him. We didn't have a track record of 4 years in office. You know, there was a lot of speculation. And, you know, I understood that people wouldn't take what I said necessarily as gospel about what I thought could happen. I get that. But now we know. We've seen him and we've heard him. And so we need to do a better job of making it absolutely clear that someone who says these things, you know, maybe he wouldn't jail all of his political opponents. One is one too many. Maybe he wouldn't try to force out of business the, you know, members of the press who didn't agree with him. One is one too many. We go down the line. And maybe this would be our last election, because someone who will not accept the validity of an election is someone who doesn't believe in elections. He believes in his own power, his own right to power, and his demand that he be installed regardless of whether he gets the votes or not.
Yeah, and you know, I have always, personally and on this program, had great faith in the Supreme Court. to be the leveling wind. Unfortunately, when, as you said, you read the D.C. Circuit opinion on presidential immunity, I must say I was shocked that the Roberts Court didn't just affirm it, send it down. They are dragging their feet, and it certainly looks political. So do we depend on them if they can't even handle a simple, basic issue on immunity? I don't think so. I want to, and Tim Scott, let's not get started about Tim Scott and other Republicans who are now also refusing to say they'll accept the results of the elections.